Good morning, everybody. I welcome everyone joining us today, whether by live stream or in person here in the Albert and Shirley Small Chapel. Welcome to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series lecture. It's great to be back in person as a community. Washington Hebrew is still thrilled to be presenting in partnership with the Jewish Book Council, Andrew Feiler, the author and the photographer responsible for the amazing photos in the book, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 schools that changed America. We encourage everyone here in person to join us for a book signing immediately after the program. Rabbi Shankman is out of town for the Central Conference of American Rabbis annual conference, and so asked that I introduce Andrew this morning. I'm honored to do so. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Howard Morse, a longtime member of Washington Hebrew. Sue asked me to moderate today since I also serve on the board of the Rosenwald Park Campaign, a nonprofit which is working to establish a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park with a headquarters in Chicago and sites across the South, preserving a number of Rosenwald schools. The campaign has had some success getting legislation passed through Congress early last year, the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools Act of 2020, mandating that the National Park Service undertake a study leading to the creation of a park. The campaign itself has published several studies to support the effort, including a historic context study on Rosenwald's life and study of schools for potential inclusion in a park, which are available, if I can shamelessly promote our efforts, on the campaign's website, www.rosenwaldpark.org. Critically, such a park would be the first national park honoring a Jewish American. Washington Hebrew is one of more than 125 organizations that have officially supported the campaign. Thank you, Rabbi Shankman, Rabbi Lustig, and WHC President Mark Director for making that happen. Other supporters range from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to the Union for Reform Judaism. And thanks to our speaker, we have the support of the Temple in Atlanta, as well as the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and I think several others. Andrew Feiler serves on the advisory council for our campaign, but his credentials obviously go far beyond that. Andrew is a fifth-generation Georgian who grew up Jewish in Savannah and who, as he says, has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South. Andrew got his bachelor's in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in history from Oxford, and an MBA from Stanford. He's worked in consulting, IT, and real estate. He's also long been civically engaged, serving on the boards of such organizations as the Civic League for Regional Atlanta, Public Broadcasting Atlanta, the Anti-Defamation League Southeast Region, and Fair Fight Action. Andrew is an award-winning photographer. His work has been published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Smithsonian Magazine, Eye on Photography, The Forward, and elsewhere. And his work has been shown in museums from the Octagon here in DC to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. His awards from such institutions as the National Portrait Gallery. And A Better Life for Their Children is not Andrew's only book. A 2015 book, without regard to sex, race, or color, focused on the largely abandoned campus of an historically black college, Atlanta's Morris Brown College. Our focus today is on Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald Schools. As Andrew writes in the introduction to his stunning new book, Julius Rosenwald led Sears, Roebuck Company from 1908 until his death in 1932. He helped turn Sears into the world's largest retailer and he became one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. Booker T. Washington was one of the most prominent African American voices in the late 19th and early 20th century. Born into slavery, he became an educator and was founding principal of Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. Rosenwald and Washington met in 1911. At that time, black public schools in the South were usually in terrible facilities with outdated materials and a tiny fraction of the funding provided for educating white children. Many communities did not even have public schools for African American students. Rosenwald and Washington, forging one of the earliest collaborations between Jews and African Americans, attacked this education challenge with originality and sophistication and created the program that became known as the Rosenwald Schools. From 1912 to 1932, the Rosenwald Schools program built 4,977 schools for African American children across 15 southern and border states. The Rosenwald Schools program changed America. Let me turn the microphone now over to Andrew to tell more of the story and tell us about at least a few of the photographs in his book, the people in them, and the circumstances in which the photos were taken, all of which I know will keep us riveted. I will note for those of you watching the live stream, I'm told that the slides likely won't show up very clearly, but they will be made available on the recording of the event, which will be posted on the Temple's YouTube page in a few days. Thank you for being here, Andrew.
Thank you, Howard. Great to be with you all. Thank you for your service on the campaign. This has been an extraordinary run. This book came out in the spring. I had an early experience in what we all now call the supply chain crisis. Pub date of this book was supposed to be April 1st, and the book was stuck in the port of LA. And so we actually didn't get books out of the port of LA until April 29th. So pub date officially got moved to May 1st. But as Howard said, the book was featured in Smithsonian Magazine in this exquisite double-page spread in the Wall Street Journal. These are milestones for any photographer. And this book is now in its third printing. So it has essentially been a photography bestseller, which is extraordinarily gratifying. I'm going to start with a simple premise. The Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. It dramatically reshapes the American experience. It dramatically reshapes the African American experience. And yet its story is largely unknown. It remains hidden history. And its scope and sweep are surely unknown. And so it's a privilege to be able to share this story with you. I'm going to start with a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. Julius Rosenwald grew up in Springfield, Illinois. He's the child of Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. If you go to downtown Springfield today, there is a 4-square-block National Historical Site, Lincoln Home National Historical Site, where they have preserved the historic buildings. And across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. Peter Ascoli, who's the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald, told me the story that he went down to the National Historical Park there and was interviewing the superintendent and asked him, did he happen to know where Julius Rosenwald's birth home was? And the superintendent says, you're sitting in it. Turns out it's the offices of the superintendent of the National Historical Park. At that time, there was not a plaque in front of that park. Today, there is a plaque, and it was placed there by the campaign to create this Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park, and it's been my honor to serve on the advisory council of that campaign. So Julius Rosenwald rises to become the president of Sears, Roebuck Company. They didn't have the term CEO back then. And with innovations like satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, he turned Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era, and he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history, and his cause is what later becomes known as civil rights. And he is motivated by his Judaism. He says, I believe in America, but I do not see how America can go forward if part of her people are left behind. He sees America, he appreciates America as a safe haven from anti-Semitism, and he sees that safe haven weakened by how America treats its African-American citizens. This portrait of Booker T. Washington hangs above the mantle of the president's home at what is now Tuskegee University. As Howard said, Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically black college, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. This is a rare portrait of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students and former teachers were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. In fact, on the cover of my book is a photograph of the restored classroom in the Pine Grove School, and you can see the quilt in the back left-hand corner. So Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington meet in May of 1911, just over 110 years ago. And at the time, you have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. 90% of African Americans live in the South. By the end of the Great Migration, roughly 1970, 56% of African Americans live in the South. It's one of the largest displacements, internal displacements of people in human history. But in 1911, 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so these two men, they meet in Chicago, and Booker T. Washington invites Julius Rosenwald to come onto the board of Tuskegee. And later that year, Julius Rosenwald takes a train down to Tuskegee, is impressed with what he sees, agrees to serve on the board of Tuskegee. But the two men like each other, and they develop this friendship, and they keep talking, what can we do together? And in 1912, they create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. And this is a photograph of students and teachers out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School in Jefferson County, Kentucky. It's Louisville. And I have to tell you how the program works, because there is genius in the design of this program. They reach out to the black communities of the South. They say, we want you to be a partner in your own progress. And if you, the black community, will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, or labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate about creating black-white dialogue as a foundation of future progress, and these have to be public schools. While we welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum the school system has to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. You do those two things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now think about this. The black community has to participate. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants in philanthropic history. The white school board has to agree to participate. This is one of the earliest examples of public-private partnership. And so I'm going to digress for a second and just tell you a little bit more about the importance of this photograph. Photography actually plays a role in shaping the history of the Rosenwald Schools program. The program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on the program. And Booker T. Washington has photographs made just like this of students and teachers standing proudly in front of their schools, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities. And he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved to see these photographs that he is committing to expand the program. All of my bodies of photography prior to this body of photography were in color. But it was in recognition of the importance that photography plays in shaping this program, and the fact that these images continue to be made throughout the history of this program. They become part of the visual narrative and the visual history of this program, that this entire body of work was shot in not only in black and white, but horizontal because of the linearity of these photographs. So this, so from the 1912, when the program begins, the Lochapoka community in Lee County, Alabama, is the first community to raise the required matching funds. The school no longer exists. This is a historical marker that's there. 1912 until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia. 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states, and the results are transformative. I'm going to talk about the impact in just a second, but let me tell you a little bit about the Eleanor Roosevelt School. My process is to read and shoot and to shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting and the shooting informs the reading. There are 100 Rosenwald schools listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I have read 50 of those nomination forms. These nomination forms, I live in a home. My wife and I restored this old building, and we got it listed on the National Register. So I knew how much information was packed into a National Register nomination form because I've written one. I've read 50 of those National Register nomination forms for Rosenwald schools, and the story I'm about to tell you comes from the nomination form of the Eleanor Roosevelt School. In 1929, Franklin Roosevelt, not yet president, sees a Rosenwald School in Meriwether County, Georgia. This is Warm Springs. And he calls up the Rosenwald Fund and he says, we need more Rosenwald schools in Meriwether County. It's 1929. The recession has set in. The school board is unable to contribute. The black community is unable to make its contribution, so the idea languishes. Well, the formal Rosenwald Schools program ended in 1932. So actually from 1912 to 1932, 20 years, they built 4,977 schools. In 1937, President Roosevelt calls up Edwin Embry, who's running the Rosenwald Fund, and says, I'm ready for my school. And Edwin Embry says to President Roosevelt, well, Mr. President, the program formally ended 5 years ago, but for you, Mr. President, we'll make an exception. So the school board contributes, the black community contributes, the Rosenwald Fund contributes, the WPA contributes. And the head of the WPA is in the Oval Office reporting to President Roosevelt, who asks about the status of the school, and he's told that they are $1,000 short of the money needed to build the school. And in the Oval Office, President Roosevelt pulls out his checkbook and writes the $1,000 check that closes the gap. And later that year, he presides over the dedication of this school. Now, as you can see, the school is in distress. It was after it closed, and this school did not close. I mean, it was open until the early 1970s. It was sold to a family in the cabinet business, and they bricked up the windows and they used it for storage of materials for the cabinet business. At the time I was out shooting this work, you see there's this for sale sign out in front. I'm pleased to report that through the work of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, a brother and sister team have now purchased the school with appropriate conservation easements on it, preservation easements on it, and they're in the process now of raising the funds to restore the schoolhouse and bring it back to its roots as a community center and museum. So as I said, the results of this program were transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II, and the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrated Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald Schools. So as Howard said, I grew up in Savannah. I grew up as a member of the congregation Mikveh Israel, the third oldest congregation in America. It was founded in 1733. In 1980, my mom became the first female president in that illustrious history. But I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. I moved back to Atlanta in 1995, and I have lived in the 5th Congressional District that entire time. And so I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis's for 25 years. And Congressman Lewis, being the most prominent then surviving alum of Rosenwald Schools program, I reached out to him and asked if he would write the introduction to this book. And he said to me, "I'm not sure that I'm comfortable writing the history of Rosenwald Schools. I just know I went to school there." And I said, "Congressman Lewis, I will have an essay in this book. There's also going to be 2 essays by prominent African-American preservationists. We'll have the history covered. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What role did education play in your life?" And he said, "Oh, I can do that." And so it was on October 29th of 2019 that I found myself in Congressman Lewis's Washington office, sitting around this round desk or table in the middle of his space, working with him on the introduction to this book. It was exactly 2 months later, on December 29th, 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with his pancreatic cancer diagnosis. And so his introduction to this book is one of Congressman Lewis's last public acts. I didn't set out on this project to have this extraordinary one-on-one experience with Congressman Lewis, particularly at this late stage in his life. But what an incredible gift that experience was as part of this overall journey. Before I move on, I also want to tell you just a little bit, use this photograph. So there are 21 portraits in those 85 photographs in this book. 21 of them are portraits. And I want to use this photograph to tell you a little bit about the language of my portraits. So first of all, Congressman Lewis's office reached out to me and said, "Can we do this portrait in his Atlanta office?" And somewhat boldly I said no, because to me the settings of these photographs are part of what is part of the story that it's telling. And I really wanted this photograph to be in Congressman Lewis's Washington office, because to me that was a statement of power and a statement of achievement. In addition, I never told anybody what expressions to put on their face, because I wanted them to have agency in how they help tell their role in this story. And I didn't tell anybody what to wear, because I wanted them to be authentic. So at the end of my session with Congressman Lewis working on the introduction, his jacket had been drooped around the back of his chair, and he picked up, he put it on, and he has this cancer awareness ribbon, and he said, "Should I take this ribbon off?" I said, "Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you, and that is the authentic you, leave it on." And what poignant point that becomes to find out what happens just 60 days later. So this is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, the oldest surviving Rosenwald school. I had never heard of Rosenwald Schools until February of 2015. I had just turned my first book into my publisher. It would not come out until later that year. I was thinking about what I was going to do next. And I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who originated the role of African American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And she was the first person to tell me about Rosenwald Schools. And the story shocked me. I'm a 5th-generation Jewish Georgian. I've been a progressive activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald Schools? So I came home and I Googled Rosenwald Schools, and I found that while there were some books on the topic, mostly academic, not all academic, but there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I set out to do exactly that. And over the next 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states. Of the original 4,978 schools, about 500 survive. Only half of those have been restored. I shot 105 of those surviving schools, and the result is this book. So I'm going to take you inside the Emory School, because I want to talk about the architectural language of this program. To do that, though, I have to tell you about the story of Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect. He happens to be the great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in Chicago political circles and one of the principal advisors to President Obama during his entire tenure in the White House. After graduating from MIT, he is hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee's campus today, which in itself is a National Historical Site, many of the exquisite buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. And so Robert Robinson Taylor leads the team of architects that lay out the architectural principles of the Rosenwald Schools program. This is progressive era architecture in service to education. Large windows on the left here, these banks of large 9/9 pane windows to let in lots of light, because these buildings usually did not originally have electricity. On the right, cloakrooms so that dirty outer garments could be kept away from and not sully the education spaces. Brick chimneys to vent the potbelly stoves that kept the schoolhouse warm on winter days. And then you see about 2/3 of the way back in this space, this room divider. That divider would have originally had in it a series of doors that could be closed off to separate the two education spaces, or accordioned back to open up the space so that it could be used as a community center outside of education hours. These basic principles persist throughout the entire history of the program, and they're laid out at the very, very beginning by Robert Robinson Taylor and his team. Now, this is what's known as a one-teacher school. This is a two-teacher school, the Hope School in Pomeria, South Carolina. James Hope was the state school superintendent in South Carolina, a strong advocate of Rosenwald Schools, such that every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald Schools. His family all but donated. They actually sold 2 acres of land for the school for $5. Back then, that was even essentially a donation. And the local community named the school the Hope School in his honor. When the school closed, it fell into great disrepair, and the grandnephew of James Hope, Ron Hope, was a career Army officer, retired back to Pomeria, South Carolina, and basically had this, the way he told me the story was, he was on a pension from the United States government. And so what could he give back? And so he decided to single-handedly restore this schoolhouse. And if you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, you will find from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. So this is a 2-teacher school. This is a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Now, the architectural standards of the Rosenwald Schools program was, number one, they were to be modest. That was in part to avoid cost, and in part to avoid attracting the ire, otherwise known as arson, from the local white citizenry. But more specifically, there was a rule that there be no cupolas. I call that the no Doodads Rule. You notice the school has a cupola. And the reason that the cupolas were forbidden in the Rosenwald Schools program is that one of the architectural leaders of the program believed that a cupola was derivative of church architecture, and that on a schoolhouse it violated separation of church and state. But this schoolhouse has a cupola. Remember, the black community has to contribute, and you can count as that they count as that contribution cash, land, materials, or labor. This is 1920s America. That cupola is an expression of African American community agency. They wanted a cupola, and they built a cupola. In fact, of the 105 schools I went to, 3 of them had cupolas. And you're going to see in a moment another extraordinary example of African American community agency in constructing their schoolhouse. Now, notice, so what you've seen before is 1, 2, and 3 teacher schools, small white clapboard buildings. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. So when I was shooting this work, I knew this was an incredible story, but how do you tell it visually? I started out shooting exterior images. And it's just this fascinating historical narrative, this architectural narrative. But when I realized that only half of these schools had been restored, I realized that I had to tell the adaptive reuse narrative, because very few of these schools are still in use for educational purposes. Most of them were too small and outgrew that a long time ago. This is one of the 105 schools I went to, 5 are still in use as educational purposes. This is one of them. This is now a magnet middle school. But most of them had outgrown that. And so in order to tell the adaptive reuse narrative, I had to get inside. And in order to do that, I needed permission. And that's when I met all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, historians, and I bring their story into this narrative with portraits. Now, several of the members of the Little Rock Nine who attended Little Rock Central attended the Dunbar School. It's 1 mile from this school, and if this building looks vaguely familiar with its Art Deco detailing, it's because the architect of Little Rock Central is also the architect of the Dunbar School. These are the Pleasant Hill quilters. 3 of these women had parents who attended Rosenwald Schools. 3 of them attended Rosenwald Schools, and LaJoyce Flanagan, who's in the front row in the center, taught in this school. When the Pleasant Hill School closed, it went into, as you can imagine, great disrepair, and these women got together and quilted to preserve this school. They sold quilts to raise the funds to restore the Pleasant Hill School and to turn it into the community center that it is today. And these women gather most Mondays in the schoolhouse to quilt. And I'll simply add that I commissioned them to do a quilt for, and it's our bedspread is a quilt today from the Pleasant Hill Quilters. This is the Lincoln School in Pikeville, Tennessee. It has been also turned into a community center. Notice that all of the walls and ceilings are covered in decorative pressed tin. This exquisitely beautiful building, and this is another incredible example of African American community agency, because there's no other Rosenwald school that I'm aware of that has this. And this is an extraordinary expression of the pride that this community had in their schoolhouse. So some of these schoolhouses have been turned into community centers. Some are church halls. Many of these schoolhouses were built next to churches because the church either donated the land or led the fundraising effort. This is the Denby School in Virginia, where the schoolhouse actually became the church for a while, and then they added on to it. And the Warfield School in Tennessee, this beautiful portrait of Abraham Lincoln with the shadow of these 9/9 pane windows that are so iconic in Rosenwald Schools architecture. But many of these schools remain in great disrepair. This is the Hannah School in Newberry County, South Carolina. It's across the street from the Hannah AME Church, which is the namesake for the schoolhouse. The graveyard from the church has grown up around the school, and in the kind of detail that you can simply never make up. This schoolhouse is on Deadfall Road. But you see, this schoolhouse is at risk of collapse, and these spaces are the locus of history and memory in a community, and it's so important to save these spaces and save these stories and save this history. That there's an inherent plea for preservation in this work, where only half of the surviving schoolhouses have been restored, and indeed, there were times on this journey that I came across schoolhouses that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by emergency fencing or yellow caution tape. This is the W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County with this, it had been demolished a week before I got there because it had been deemed unsafe, with this Coke machine standing sentinel in the midst of the rubble. But as I mentioned, the people that I meet become really the emotional heart of this narrative. These are brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley. This portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs above the doorway has hung in this space since 1923, when the K. Rose School opened. Brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley attended this school. They both went to college. They both went to graduate school. They both became educators. Frank became a high school math and science teacher. Charles became a middle school principal. They have four sisters, all of whom went through this schoolhouse, all went to college. These 6 siblings have 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened without this schoolhouse. And this is the Bay Springs School in Forest County, Mississippi. To tell you the story of the Bay Springs School, I have to tell you about Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer Sr.'s grandfather donated the 2 acres of land for this schoolhouse. Vernon Damer attended this school, and when the schoolhouse closed in 1958, it reverted to Vernon Damer because the grandfather had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause. And Vernon Damer turned this schoolhouse into a center of civil rights activism. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. Their son, Dennis, told me that in Freedom Summer, this is 1964, on July 4th, the Damer family threw a picnic for the voter registration volunteers, black and white, and at age 11, it was the first time that Dennis Damer had seen blacks and whites socialize together. In addition, Vernon Damer, who was the head of the NAACP in Forest County, when he drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to attempt to register to vote, he would have them park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their cars and harassed. All of this, as you can imagine, drew the attention of the KKK. And on the night of January 10th, 1966, Vernon Damer's home was firebombed. And he stood in the front window of his house with a gun, holding off the attackers while his wife Ellie got the children out the back door. And Vernon Damer died as a result of his injuries in this fire. This is inside the Bay Springs School. This is Ellie Damer. Ellie Damer went to a different Rosenwald school in Mississippi, went to college, became an educator, taught in the Bay Springs School. And when the schoolhouse closed in 1958, because the state of Mississippi built a larger consolidated school for African Americans, this is 1958, 4 years after Brown v. Board, the state of Mississippi is building new segregated schools. In 1958, the schoolhouse closed. Ellie Damer is denied employment at this new school because of her husband's activism. And she had to get a job working in a different school district 35 miles away, and she taught there for the next 21 years. And their son Dennis has recently led the restoration of the schoolhouse back into a community center to its civil rights era roots. And this is the last school I'm going to share with you today. This is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. At the moment this image is taken, it's in the final stages of restoration into a museum and community center. And this is inside the Hopewell School. You'll notice that the modeled walls, that's primer. You've got plastic sheeting on the floor. The potbelly stove on the right is wrapped in plastic sheeting. The photograph in the middle of this image is from the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin Mcdonald, both of whom were born into slavery. And upon emancipation, Mcdonald start raising farm animals. They acquire some land. They acquire some more land. They eventually acquire 1,200 acres. When the Rosenwald Schools program comes to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donates the 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher is their daughter. One of her first students is her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, on the left, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. They both went off to college. They both came back to Bastrop County as educators and had an entire career as educators. And they're in the final stages of leading this restoration of the Hopewell School. I found this story time and time again. Former students becoming teachers, becoming the keepers of history and memory in a community. And it was stories like this. My previous book of photography was, there's literary content in a book like this, essays and such, but the photographs really stand as photographs. In this particular, but in the course of doing this project, I came across such extraordinary stories. I found Rosenwald Schools directly connected to the Trail of Tears, to the Tuskegee syphilis study, to the Tuskegee Airmen, to the litigation of Brown v. Board, embezzlement, murder, that I felt compelled to write a short story that goes with each photograph, or in some cases, pairs of photographs. So I hope you'll spend time with these photographs, but I hope you'll read the stories because I think you'll be moved. I think you'll be inspired. It's really been an extraordinary journey. And the last photograph I'm going to share with you is really a story about a different component of Julius Rosenwald's legacy. This is a book about Rosenwald Schools. But the Rosenwald Fellowships were an enormously important part of Julius Rosenwald's legacy, too important to leave out. So from 1928 to 1948, the Rosenwald Fellowships provided grants to both whites and blacks that were some of the leading intellectuals of the 20th century. In the case, there were 278 grants to white liberals, such as newspaper editor Ralph McGill, playwright Lillian Smith. But there were 587 grants to African American creatives and intellectuals that are the who's who of African American life of the 20th century. Langston Hughes, Jacob Lawrence, Marian Anderson, the Clarks, and the first photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald grant was Gordon Parks. Now, Gordon Parks, who was the first African-American photographer in for Life magazine, has long been sort of one of my heroes in the photography space and a role model for me. It is through Gordon Parks that I learned that art can be a mechanism of activism. And I had the great privilege of spending some time with Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was on book tour for his memoir, Voices in the Mirror. Roll forward to today, and Leslie Parks Bailey, Gordon Parks' daughter, lives in Atlanta and is actually a friend. And so as I was thinking about how I wanted to tell this part of the story, I called up Leslie. I said, okay, Leslie, I got this crazy idea. I'd like to do a portrait of you holding up a photograph made by your dad as a way of telling the Rosenwald Fellowship story. She said, it's a great idea. And she puts me in touch with the folks at the Gordon Parks Foundation, who immediately email back a digital image of this self-portrait by Gordon Parks. And they said, well, this self-portrait was part of Gordon Parks' application to the Rosenwald Fellowship. I'm like, that will do. So they send me this print, and I knew from the beginning, I was trying to conceptualize how I wanted to do this photograph. Leslie's a yoga instructor, so I wanted to take advantage of that. But I also knew that I wanted it on a manhole cover. Because one of Gordon Parks' seminal essays for Life magazine was a 1952 photo illustration of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And there's the invisible man coming out of the manhole. And so I wanted to reference that part of Gordon Parks' photographic legacy. And so the result is this image. So I'm going to end with just a couple thoughts on the title of this book. First of all, let me tell you where the title came from. I mentioned that of the 105 schools that I went to, only 5 are in use for educational purposes. One of those is the Plaisance School in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. It was the original 4-teacher school, and then they added on to it in 1960. And I had been there earlier in my journeys, and the way it's laid out, it just makes it very, very difficult to shoot. It's just difficult to get an angle that works well. So I decided I was going to go back, and I had this idea that I was going to do this sort of school buses, this blurry school buses as they went by the beginning. It went by in front of the school early in the morning. It turned out that didn't work, but either way, I'm going to be out in front of this schoolhouse, active elementary school at 6:30 in the morning. I better tell somebody I'm coming. So I called and introduced myself to the principal, which was fine. And then so I'm out there at 6:30, and I take my photograph. I'm actually out there till about 9, until I finally get the right light and the right cloud structure. And then I go in and introduce myself to the principal. It turns out she knows a lot about Rosenwald Schools, including the fact that this schoolhouse, 30% of the money came from the Rosenwald Fund, 70% of the money came from the black community. This is a black community that is already being taxed to pay for white schools. And she marvels at this commitment that they have to education. And she says they worked and they strove and they did what they could to make a better life for their children, because in their eyes, education was truly liberation. And it was from that conversation that I took the title of this book. But if you think about it in a broader context, Julius Rosenwald was looking for a better life for his children. Booker T. Washington was looking for a better life for his children. The black communities who had to dig deep to pay for their contributions to these schools were looking for better lives for their children. At the heart of this story are people that reach across divides of race, religion, and region. And they fundamentally change the country. And I think it speaks to all of us today on the front lines of social change, that individual actions matter and we can change the world. Congressman Lewis writes in the introduction to this book that each of us have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate. That when we see something that is not right and not just, we must find a way to get in the way. And so I will close with a refrain of Congressman Lewis's most famous calling: may we all find our paths to the making of good trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was terrific. We will now open things up for questions, but I will start off, use my prerogative to do so. So one of the elements of this story is clearly the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, which I would like to look at more broadly as the black-Jewish relationship, what brought the two of them together, but also if you can look at relationships more recently over history. There's the relationship of Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel, and perhaps in your neighborhood, even today, the relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. So what are your thoughts, given all the work that you've put together, about the importance of the black-Jewish relationship in this story?
So the first thing I'll say is Julius Rosenwald's interest, again, in what later becomes known as civil rights. That was not a term that was used in 1910, 1911 America. It actually predates his meeting with Booker T. Washington. In 1910, the leaders of the YMCA in Chicago come to Julius Rosenwald, and they ask him if he will contribute to creating an African-American YMCA in Chicago. And he shocks his visitors with two statements. In 1910 America, it cost about $100,000 to build a YMCA. And Julius Rosenwald says, I will contribute $25,000 for this YMCA if the rest of the community, black and white, will raise the remaining $75,000. And then he says, and I will do that for any major city in America. 24 YMCAs for the African American community were built under this program, including the one in Washington, D.C., and including in Atlanta, the Butler Street Y, which still exists, and it was as a storied history unto itself in the civil rights movement. So Booker T. Washington knows of this interest of Julius Rosenwald in progressive causes, and he goes to Chicago with an agenda to meet Julius Rosenwald and ask him if he will become part of this go on the board at Tuskegee. But the two men like each other, and they develop this friendship. This idea of the challenge grant, self-help. Self-help was a major building block of the pedagogy of Tuskegee Institute. They share a lot. They share a philosophy. They share values, and the success and the depth of this program. This program. The details of this program were worked out by the two men together. And Booker T. Washington died. The program starts in 1912. Booker T. Washington dies in 1915, but the program continues on until 1932. That friendship, that relationship, is one of the earliest collaborations between blacks and Jews. The Niagara movement is in 1905. The NAACP is founded in 1909. There's one Jew on the board at each of those. It's the same person as a labor organizer out of New York. But this is very, very early, and I think that friendship sets this foundation. And in fact, I believe that there is a direct connection between this friendship and this relationship of these two men in setting the foundation for the civil rights movement. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, with his long white beard flowing, marching with Dr. King, and who famously says that when he marched with Dr. King, it felt like his feet were praying. And what happened in Georgia about this time last year, where John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock crisscrossed the state of Georgia together for 2 months in a runoff election, developing not just a close political alliance, but very close personal friendship. I know both men well. I was just with Senator Warnock last Sunday afternoon. That friendship, that alliance, that collaboration of John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, and Georgia sends its first Jew and its first African American to the United States Senate. That stands on the shoulders of the relationship and friendship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington.
I have additional questions, but does anyone, please go ahead.
So late in the program, starting roughly around 1928, the program does a pivot. It shifts from focusing on the construction of new schools to focusing on educational outcomes. So they start incentivizing brick construction because they realize these schools are going to last longer than they had anticipated. They start incentivizing libraries. They start incentivizing longer school terms. They start funding school buses. And they start putting more money into historically black colleges in order to create more African American teachers. Julius Rosenwald dies in 1932. The Rosenwald Fund continued, and Julius Rosenwald was one of the earliest philanthropists to say that all the money needed to be given away within X number of years of his death. He believed that the generation that helped create the wealth, customers of Sears, that should be the generation that benefited from the philanthropy associated from that wealth. And so he mandated that all the funds be given away within 25 years of his death. In fact, the fund spends down within 15 years, and the Rosenwald Fund shuts down in 1948. This has become very fashionable in philanthropy today. Bill Gates has said this, Warren Buffett has said this. at the time it was unheard of, but I think it's also one of the reasons why Julius Rosenwald is less well known than some of his philanthropic peers like Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller that continue to have foundations that persist in their name. With the death of Julius Rosenwald, the sense that they have basically done what they can do. Let me give you these incredible set of statistics. If you take out Missouri, which only had 3 Rosenwald schools because it joined the program late, the other 14 schools, 2/3 of all counties had Rosenwald schools. Yeah. I'm sorry? The other 14 states, 2/3 of those counties had Rosenwald schools. If you take the counties that had African American school-aged children, 85% had Rosenwald schools. So the program had really sort of accomplished what it was going to accomplish, and so it starts to shift towards things like teachers at historically black colleges, Rosenwald fellowships, and that's really why it winds down that part of the program. So let me tackle your first question first. Julius Rosenwald had a number of children, some of whom were more philanthropically engaged than others. His daughter Edith married a man named Stern in New Orleans. They were a force behind the creation of Dillard University. If you go to the New Orleans Museum of Art today, it is the Edith Rosenwald Stern Auditorium. Their home, Longview, is actually owned by the New Orleans Museum of Art and is a historic home on display. So they had quite a philanthropic record in New Orleans and in the surrounding area. I have not studied his children, to be honest, and so I do know now a number of the surviving members of the Rosenwald family. It turns out that 2 friends of mine in Atlanta are direct descendants of Julius Rosenwald. I mean, who would have figured? And then, so I'll add this other little tidbit. Julius Rosenwald, when he died, left a pool of money. If I'm correct, it was like $2.7 million that his 4 children had to give away, and they had to agree on how it was going to be used. And they used a lot of that money to get Jews out of Germany, including the family, some cousins, and there's a Bob Rosenwald who lives in Savannah, Georgia, and is good for, had an entire career with NSA, and then he and his wife retired to Savannah, Georgia, where they're friends with my parents. His grandparents were among those who were rescued with this money. Some of that money also went to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that helped fund the case of Brown v. Board. On the second question, I think these were black schools with black teachers. And there's two really important parts of that legacy. Number one, black teachers in black schools were teaching equality. They were teaching equality as an American birthright, which helps set an expectation for what becomes the civil rights movement to come. And that idea that what we teach in schools and how we teach the American story is, of course, part of what we're fighting over today. But I think that is an unheralded component of what was important about these schools. The second thing is, when we teach the story of Brown v. Board, the hero of the story is Thurgood Marshall and his team of lawyers. But there were black teachers' associations who were gathering the school-level data and feeding it up to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that helped make the case that separate but equal was inherently unequal. Ellie Damer was one of those teachers. I spent several hours in the Bay Springs School with Ellie and her son Dennis, talking about their family and their history. And she told me about this, this teachers association and being part of this group that fed this data upward. And so I think that the black teachers have this really unheralded role in what becomes, arguably the seminal legal case in American history. But then when the schools closed, and by the way, you'll notice in these images, they have I have a photograph of a school. There's certain components to the naming structure. I have the name of the school because these names are just so iconic. Sometimes they're named after churches, sometimes they're named after places, sometimes they're named after people, but I just think the names have a poetry to them. There's the county and the state because the funds flowed through the county school boards. There's the opening year, but there's also the closing year. And the reason the closing year is in there is to highlight the fact that the response to Brown varied not just by state, but by individual school district. Many of these schools were open into the 60s and some of them into the early 1970s. But when they closed, basically the white students black students, were consolidated into the white schools because the whites would not send their children to schools that had been black schools. Many of the black teachers lost their jobs. And that was a traumatic experience in the black community. It is still talked about by that generation. And it's obviously an unfortunate outcome. I'm not an education policy expert today, and so I don't profess to be an expert on the fact that that we're well aware that many of our public schools have effectively become resegregated. I know that is fraught in with its own complexity. But I think that at least answers your question in terms of these schools.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I use these National Register nomination forms, of course. That was essential. Basically, I got on the internet, and Jeannie Syriac, who I mentioned earlier, is the person from whom I heard about Rosenwald Schools. Jeannie went around the state of Georgia and found 37 surviving Rosenwald schools at the time. Now we know there's something in the 40s. And she would show up in these communities, and she would have a picture, and she would ask people, did you ever heard of this school? Might it still be here? And this was all before the internet. So she would scoff at the fact that I was using the internet. But I would, what I would do is, so at the time, the exhibition of the photographs from my first book were traveling. I actually didn't mention there's an exhibition of this work that originated last year at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. It's now at the Charlotte Museum of History, and it will travel from there to Columbus, Georgia, Memphis, Nashville, to the brand new Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans. It's just opened in May. Then the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and that takes me through the end of 2024. I'm working on 2025 and 2026, and hopefully bringing it to Washington. The exhibition of my first work was traveling, and so, for example, it went to the International Civil Rights Center in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is in the old Woolworths, where the lunch counter sit-in movement began February 1st, 1960. And I would research these Rosenwald schools, and I would line them up by GPS coordinates, and I loaded up my exhibition in the back of my wife's SUV, and I would drive these back roads shooting Rosenwald schools. I would hang the exhibition. I would shoot schools all the way back. 4 months later, I'd go take this exhibition down and do this all over again. And as I got into my research, this is when I started to come across these stories, right? I'll give you an example of a story I didn't tell. There's a photograph in the book of Rosenwald Hall in Lima, Oklahoma. And we've heard of the Trail of Tears. It's the displacement of 5 Native American tribes from east of the Appalachians to what later becomes the state of Oklahoma. What we're not told is that those 5 Native American tribes had slaves. And they took those slaves with them on that arduous journey west. And upon emancipation, those emancipated African Americans formed all black townships, in part for safety and in part for economics. They sent recruiters to the South to recruit people to come to this promised new land. Toni Morrison's novel Paradise is set in these black townships. 11 of those black townships had Rosenwald schools. The only surviving one is Rosenwald Hall in Lima, Oklahoma. When I'm out there, you're doing your research and you come across stories like that, how can you not tell that story, right? So a lot of it was on the internet. A lot of it was then just stumbling I found a particular school, finding what the connection was to the broader narrative.
I think your book also has a picture. Isn't there a map that the Rosenwald Fund kept that shows lots of dots of where the schools are, at least at some point in time?
Yeah, at the end of the program, on July 1st, 1932, the Rosenwald Fund published a map. Interestingly, in the historical sense, it's in a brochure. They don't know where the original map was. It was clearly a much bigger map. But all they have is a surviving brochure. And the offices of the Rosenwald Fund were in Nashville, and so the archives are at Fisk University. And anyway, yes, so this map is in the book, and it's sort of one of those key historical records that we have.
And I will say that the Rosenwald Park campaign, in which I'm involved, went to all the state historic preservation offices in all of those states to request nominations of schools for potential inclusion in the national park. You mentioned, but one other element of the story of Julius Rosenwald is the fact that he was a child of German Jewish immigrants. Tell us a little more about how the family ended up in Springfield, Illinois, where he was born and raised, and what led him to, the side of the story of him becoming a success at Sears.
Well, as I said, the parents, were quite specific. They were fleeing religious persecution. They had come to New York, but like a lot of immigrants of that era, they had relatives or friends in other places, and they moved further west, and they settled in Springfield. Julius Rosenwald, when he did not finish high school. He went into the garment industry originally in New York. And then came back and was in Chicago. The garment industry, by the way, of that era was transformed by the Civil War, because for the first time it was really in the making of uniforms for Civil War soldiers that they standardized sizes. And that created an explosion of the sort of mass manufacture of garments. And that was how he ended up as a supplier originally to Sears, Roebuck and Company. Sears and Roebuck had a falling out. Rosenwald and his brother-in-law, Nussbaum, bought out Roebuck. Sears and Nussbaum have a falling out. So Rosenwald and Sears buy out Nussbaum. And then Sears goes public in 1906. In 1908, Rosenwald becomes president of Sears, and eventually he buys Sears out. But he kept the name because he didn't want to be, he was worried about anti-Semitism associated with, if they had changed the name to Rosenwald, that it would have brought up anti-Semitism in the workplace. Interestingly enough, Dennis Damer told me the story that the Sears catalog was transformative for African Americans in the South, because if they went to white stores, they suffered all these indignities, right? They couldn't try the clothing on. They had to wait after the white customers were taken care of, and they could order things directly through the catalog. And the white merchants of the South saw this as a threat, and they started spreading rumors that Sears was Jewish and Roebuck was black. I don't know, did I answer your question? So the historical record is ambiguous. There is the very last Rosenwald School in my book is actually a street sign, because it's Rosenwald Lane. It's a neighborhood that used to be called Colored Town in Brevard, North Carolina, that was renamed Rosenwald because of the school. That first school burned down, and the school that is on that site now is the second school of that location. There are a number, there was a school on the campus of Kentucky State University. It burned down. The second one was built. It burned down. Then the third school was built. There are a number of examples in the historical record of schools that were burned down. I am not aware of one where it is specifically identified that it was racial animus or white arsonists. I just know a lot. But we do know that a lot of them burned down, in fact, the Shiloh School, which is the school specifically associated, that's in Notasulga, Alabama, home of Zora Neale Hurston. That school, which is associated with the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, that's the second school in that location. The first one burned down. So we know that there were a lot of the schools burned down. there's not a direct link in any of those cases that I'm aware of where they can say that it was specifically white racial animus. At the beginning, but here's another part of the story though. At the beginning of the program, the vast majority of the money comes from Rosenwald and the black community. But as the program continues, more and more money comes from the white community, such that by the end of the program, 64% of the money actually has come from public funds. Some of that is the role of white liberals like James Hope, who is the state school superintendent of South Carolina that I spoke about. Some of that is Julius Rosenwald giving air cover through his contribution. But a lot of it has to do with the Great Migration. Because as the program goes on, the Great Migration is accelerating. And the South is losing its workforce. In the white school systems, those leaders start to understand that if they're going to keep the workforce in the South, they have to provide better educational opportunities. And that's the single biggest driver of the shift toward more public funding of these schools.
Well, if there are no other questions from everyone, let me thank you all for being here. It is good to be back and in person. And thank Andrew for being here and presenting. And he does have copies of his book to sign afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to be here.